after playing Cuba Libre once or twice, I was like, this is good. Like, I'm not seeing how this is. Think I still like Root better. But after playing like a larger map version of it, I maybe like this. And the thing about it is, as I said way in the beginning, right? The whole idea of like the asymmetry living in both the victory conditions and the actions, I think is makes the game easier to play and easier to teach than if you symmetrize the victory condition and like wildly make the actions wildly asymmetric. I love Root, but I think I love this at least as much right now.
I think with Cuba Libre, it's not just that the map is smaller; it's that Cuba as an island is linear, and it's like this kind of weird. There's very little adjacency; it's just very linear in that game, which you don't always need to be able to move from space to space, but it's also a little weird in that way. I mean, coin games usually aren't super bounded by like travel, at least for the regular forces. They can just kind of like helicopter around or whatever. But that's another thing about that map. It's not just small; it's also like connected in a really uh, simplistic way, I guess.
Yeah, I mean it's good. I definitely enjoyed playing it, but it didn't have. I just you know what? The more I think about that specific aspect, the more I think that I just need to play it more, right? And that maybe the first two plays were a little bit bumpy. Like I don't know, John, what's your feeling about this? Like you've played Root, right? Like I'm
I
thinking.
have not actually.
Oh, okay,
I've played Oath and Pax Pamir. I think are the two core Whirly games I've played before.
okay.
I've
Oath,
seen plenty of Root though.
right. Well, what do you think about
Um,
this?
it's interesting. Yeah, I came to really like the two card system. We have the active card and the one that's upcoming, and the
Right.
order of play creates really interesting um, dynamics, those moments of discussion, which I think would be altered playing asynchronously, where it's like, hey, if I don't take this event, are you going to take it? But
Right.
what are you going to do on the next card? Um, the thing which I'm wrapping my head around, like sort of in terms of who is this game for, right? Because I've said a couple times this is outside of my usual
Right.
type of game in terms of theme, complexity, etc. It's the first coin game I've played because it's like simultaneously a really sort of rulesy, semi-historically accurate, you know, people might balk at this term, but like war game adjacent thing. Lots of cubes, lots of fiddly rules,
Right.
and also like super random and thematic, right? Right, like with all of these cards that are getting flipped, which are heavily change what you can do, and so like, is this game for hardcore historical grognards, or is it for like Ameritrash, I just want to see what happens people, or somewhere in between? Like,
I,
what
I,
do y'all
I
think?
I think it's more. I mean, to me, it's more almost more Euro. Like, I don't see it as being as granular and as grognardy as a war game. As a war game, there's not as much like the combat and the movement and the logistics are sort of. To me, this game's more about economy of action,
Hmm.
less about logistical play and economical play. Like the economy, we had some moments where the economy sort of raised a question mark about what we could do. And economy plays into the win conditions, certainly in the case of the Cardels and some other things as well. But I feel it's more like with wargaming. Sometimes I feel like there's a little more of that surrounding. Like if I compare this to Nevsky, like Nevsky being so like focused on logistics, that's like the whole ball game there. And I think even that is not necessarily. It's almost like the anti-war game because of how much it punishes like aggressive play. Like this you can attack, but in some ways it almost just seems like orthogonal or incidental to some of the other lines of play. So I don't know. I like even though it's a counterinsurgency and it's themed as a war game, like in play it doesn't strike me in the same way as other like chit-based war games or anything of that ilk. I don't think it's necessarily like I wouldn't call it Ameritrash though because I do think the dynamics between all these different mechanics is really rich and there's a
Mhm.
lot of really elegant interplay between all of them and there's actually a lot of beautifully thematized play as well. I think my main hiccup with this game is that I think the event cards. I definitely agree that having the like I can totally understand why people would get mad without seeing that other event card coming on the horizon, because that drove so much of our discussion, right? Is playing between like what you did in your actions to play to the next card is almost in some ways the engine that drove the game.
Yeah.
But I think the event cards being so weighted and swingy also sometimes made the play a little deterministic, because so many of our conversations, arguably too many of our conversations, were, man, I can't let this event go. Like I literally, like, there's just no way to rationalize it, right? Like I have to take this event now. And so we ended up getting boxed in on a number of turns. And I think, like, I understand the idea behind that. Like, if you let the pendulum go the other direction, there's so many options. It overloads player RAM. You get analysis paralysis. You want to sort of hem people in a little bit. But I do think this sort of occasionally boxes people in a little too much, just because the event cards are so weighted. That's just the dynamic I saw here. I do wonder if this is where the quick play and the shortened scenario also influences that as well, because we did bypass, some of the other like long-term, we were talking about the one event that like permanently removes 3 gorillas from Alk, right? Like that was kind of like a non-starter and a quick start, because like there's not enough runway to take advantage of that, right? Like you're not going to feel the pinch logistically from that. In a longer scenario where you're gradually building up that win con, and like it could definitely come in more into play. And I guess that's where I would reserve judgment on some of the event and the weighting, just because of the scenario that we played it in.
Right.
I really like playing the game. I am intrigued to see the full game, though, and to see how that swinginess plays out.
No, I think because like John earlier mentioned this game doesn't need to go twice as long. You're not wrong, but have you ever? I also assume, given what you've said, you've probably also never played Twilight Imperium.
I have not, no.
So the thing is, like, Twilight Imperium is nuts when it comes to the length, in terms, like, compared to anything else. Well, I've never played like a 3-day like hex and counter game or anything like that, right? So in terms of games I've played, Twilight Imperium is like the quintessential. You're sitting down, you meet at 9 a.m. and you disband at 9 p.m. But the stories that come out of that are just sometimes the ones that you're like, oh, do you remember when this happened, right? Do you remember when we teamed up against them and this happened? Like, it always makes for like a really good story, to the point where it doesn't, and I've never won, to be clear. I've played this game, I played it like 3 or 4 times now, and I've never, in fact, that same friend who I mentioned earlier who did not want to play Andean Abyss async, he's won every single game of TI that I've ever played, right? And yet I would play it again, right? So I think that this here maybe has the potential that if like a bunch of like really cathartic events happen in a specific sequence that set up like a game state that's unique to our game, like almost in like, weirdly enough, almost in like a legacy sense, I think that may lead to something really interesting. But I'm also being this is very wishful thinking of me, so.
I feel like when I said this game doesn't need to be, I mean, I realize it can be played faster, but the quick start version, like I said, like looking at Board Game Geek, like they think the full game takes 6 hours, which is a long game.
Yeah.
Like a TI or something, or any, I think that's a 4xe game, right?
Yeah, it's like 100% a 4xe game.
The board state at the end is basically unrecognizable from the start, right? Like you're unlocking items, you're potentially discovering locations, building maps, whatever it is. Like those games can kind of justify, hey, this is going to be really long because hour 5 is going to feel materially different from hour 2.
Right.
I don't get the impression that this game is. Like, I think it's going to be a longer version of it. Is the cubes are going to move back and forth. Like, we're going to say, this person's nearly won, this person's nearly won. It doesn't necessarily feel to me like there's enough development of board state.
You may be very correct. That's potentially the truth of the matter, right? Like, I just wonder. So if you look at I'm actually going to flip to this because I am still streaming. If you look to the cards, there are actually it's not that many, but there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 8 of these government capability cards, right? And then there's these other cards that we never saw, called Insurgent Momentum, right? And the Insurgent Momentum on the board, they go. I know, they go down here.
They go down there.
And they stay there until, again, you can look at these games and always be like, how many people have cribbed from each other, right? Because they're like those cards that you like attach to a person in PAX Premier that stay until the next dominance card, right?
Yep.
So these exist here too. So you may, irrespective of their presence, you may be correct about the not enough development, for sure.
Well, I'd also say that might reflect the reality of a lot of these conflicts. If you look at the ones they model, especially like Distant Plain, this one, probably Falling Sky, Fire in the Lake, Vietnam, they were like morasses basically that dragged out, for decades. So we're some people just sort of like stalemating out of them to some extent. So I mean that just might be part of the historical skinning, for better or worse in terms of like.
Well, and I think Andy, like you and I have talked about Nevsky, and I think you had mentioned that like you looked at the map. Like if you looked at the map of Nevsky as a point of comparison, and it looks basically exactly the same as it does as represented in Nevsky, right? There wasn't really any material change there,
right.
But I think what I would contrast here is that with Nevsky, the quick start scenario there versus the full 16 turn that we've played, there are definitely dynamics that were allowed to breathe, that we got to dig into a little bit more with the full 16 scenario.
Oh yeah, for sure.
That were not even remotely in play with the quick start. And I wonder if that's the case here, right? Now, I think it doesn't seem like that's as promising because we did touch on a lot of the active mechanics, and I do still feel like the event cards driving decision so much. It really it's all about the event cards and what you get exposed to, I guess. So I guess that's where what event cards we saw versus what we would see in a longer form play, I think that's the question to answer versus of how effective it is as a longer game versus what we saw today.
I mean, in the full game, you remove 12 of the 72 cards and then you play with 60, right? So yes, 12 events are out just so that there's, I guess, for people who've played the game like 3 dozen times, that there's still like a card that they're waiting for that might never pop up. I get that. But in terms of the cards, I'll just say, so the one thing that I do remember, and this I recall this from earlier, so when they tried it with just one card and no look ahead, basically what one of Volko's playtesters did is just like gave themselves like a little marker every time they passed in that game, right? Because what they would do is they'd be like, there's nothing good for me on this card and I don't want to do the lim off, so I'll pass. And then the next card came up, and of course they had a sequence of cards where they had no chance of becoming the eligible faction. At some point they had like 12 passes, right? And just said like, this is not fun. So that's why we need to let's see if we can, what the dynamic would be with the extra card. And I have to say, I think maybe this is why the event cards in Cuba Libre are less spicy than these. In Cuba Libre, way more often than here, the card is like, this is fine, but probably it's bait. And it looks like it should be good for me, but actually what I really need to do right now to win is this, right? And there's, no free lunch. It's less dramatic and a little bit more, it leans a little bit more heavily on the faction ops, and it's less dramatic, right? Like you can't have it both, right? You can't have crits and also have it be not luck based, right? Like it's just not possible to do both at the same time. And then usually we balance with the length of the game. But I think when it's something that feels like this, I mean, the problem with a game like this is to look at it and think of it as a deeply strategic game that you can get good at, and you probably can, but it's a political game, right? Which is always going to have its hang-ups. And I think that the only randomness in this game, as far as, well, there are a few die rolls, but like, let's be honest, that they're cute. I think the dice rolls for the attacks of the insurgent factions are like fun to watch because when they fail, it's hilarious. Which kind of feels a little bit to me like when we were always playing Nevsky, and I would be like, I can't not think of Monty Python when someone storms, right? Because it's like going to be so hilarious if it fails. I kind of think that I like, with that said, I like the variance that comes with the cards, and I also like that it has no hand management, right? So there are a couple things in here from a design perspective that I just think are really, really well done.
I'd
But
also say that like
yeah, but I do think the game potentially has the chance of going too long and being too much on razor's edge, right? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I do think that like might be premature. I know I agree that it did feel like playing around the events was like sort of mandatory or rote, but especially with the short game and also effectively all of us basically being total beginners at it.
Right.
Maybe there was non-obvious play. Like I think the ops can be easy to underestimate their power because like some of them just are so spammy. You can just put stuff everywhere.
Right.
Maybe at a higher level of play, the events even in aren't so. It's not the decision doesn't feel so automatic because like
Right.
you're trying to shore up longer term board state or something like that, not just gain some quick efficiency of your actions or whatever. I'm not sure.
Well, and again, I think in a game like, or at least again from my experience of having played two rounds of Cuba Libre, the events there are fine, and sometimes they're conditionally amazing, but more often than here, they were like not that threatening. Like I rarely in that game thought it definitely happened, but way less than here. Like in this one, I was like, man, I cannot. I have to. I don't think in the first time I played Cuba Libre, I ever tried to do the first faction op only so that the opponent wouldn't get the event, right? Like,
Yeah.
And here it was like, no, this event is like so bad for me, right? So I can't let that trigger. So I have to pass so that I get first dibs on it and can like nuke it basically by picking it or by making it not pickable. And again, I think that there's something to be said for why that could be interesting from a drama perspective, right? But I personally think we should give it a try. I think we should set up. Obviously we're not going to stream this because let's be honest. If BGG says 6 hours, it's more than 6 hours, right?
Yes.
Like BGG is for like you're making moves, like dong 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 dong, like you're just constantly making moves, right? Like I don't even know what BGG thinks. Here, let's see, because now I'm curious. BGG. I wonder what BGG thinks about. Yeah, of course I have it here already. About Twilight Imperium. 240 to 480 minutes. 4 to 8 hours. How the hell are you supposed to play Twilight Imperium in 4 hours?
Free players.
I mean, it says best with 6, and then it says playing time 4 to 8 hours, right? So that's what I mean. Like, there's no universe where that 360 minutes that they're assuming here for the full game is what it would take us. So if we take this offline and we just start a game, I think it's going to take us potentially months to get through it. But I kind of like that, even though it's a political game. And it's going to be backstabby and weird, but like I have no rationale for this other than my tastes have changed. Honestly, there's nothing
I was thinking. I mentioned that I played Here I Stand Online once, which is also rated at 360 minutes, and that literally took 6 months to play. But it was Vassal, so that's slightly higher friction.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's and that's also a game where there's like so many. Like the frontier of what you can do is super wide, so there's just a ton of stuff to think about.
I've heard very good things about that game if you can find the full 6 people. But
I mean, playing on Rally the Troops, like async, like I mean, this went longer because we were like monologuing as we played. That chewed up a fair amount of time as well, right? Like
right.
I do think I would definitely be game for trying an async game or an extended game. Through Rally the Troops.
Yeah.
I would be game for that. I think there are good bones to the system, even if some of the weights and the weighting and the tuning is a little bit
Well,
suspect.
keep in mind this is, I don't have, well, not for you, but for the general person who might be watching this bears repeating, this is the first game in the system.
This is the first game in the system, yes.
So given that it's the first game in the system and it's 10 years old, I'm pretty impressed. Is all I can say.
As a first draft or as the first time out, it nails a lot of what it's aiming for, right? Like I think that is impressive.
Yeah, I'm as I say, after playing Cuba Libre, I was like, I don't know if I'm into this coin thing, but now I'm like, now I feel like I want to explore it.
Well, for like a tiny bit of war game nerd trivia. I think that coin games were, I'm sure they're inspired by multiple things, but one game specifically I know it was inspired by was this game called Angola.
I've heard of
which is
that.
about Angola. And I think also kind of like asymmetric, four-sided. There's like stuff going on.
Right.
So
Well, not to go like back to the Stone Ages, but like one of the first board games I played when I got back into playing board games at all in like, I'm going to say 2010, 2011, Charles Pratt from the NYU Game Center invited us up to his place in Washington Heights, and he dug out like an original copy of Dune that he had got on Kickstarter, on eBay. Nice. And I remember looking at the rules, and keep in mind at that point I'd been like, oh, Citadels is kind of cool, right? So I'm like, oh, awesome. These, like, I didn't know that board games, like, because I hadn't really played a ton of board games since like Catan and Carcassonne, and so I was like, well, how much could they have developed? And then when I played I think it was Citadels in 2011, I was like, wow, this is actually really interesting. And so then I went from Citadels straight to Dune. And I was like, okay, this is for people who have some galaxy brain ability to like, because it took us like 2 hours to get through the rules. And then of course because I'd never seen anything like it, right? So if you've never played Dune, it's the 6 factions of the book. Or I don't even know if they made stuff up, but they have wildly asymmetric win conditions, right? And I think it's the folks who made one of my favorite games of all time, or if you look at some of my top 10 lists, actually my favorite game of all time, which is Cosmic Encounter, right? I think it's at least a subset of the same designer troupe made Dune as well. And that game is, as far as I can tell, maybe one of the first like big, tons of rules, super baroque, maximalist to the nth degree. And like there's one faction, it may even be the Bene Gesserit, I don't know, that guess who's in the lead after a certain round, and if then they flip that card and on that round that faction's in the lead, they just win the game. Like that kind of stuff, right? So
you're right, it's the same
four people, I don't know. But anyway, so that game is from what, 70s? I'm going to guess it's from the 70s, maybe from the 80s. So
Dune or Cosmic?
Sorry, what?
Dune or Cosmic Encounter?
Dune. Well, actually, either of them. I think they're not far apart in time.
Yeah, the OG Cosmic Encounter is 77.
Right, and when's do you know it?
The original, it's 1979 Avalon Hill. For original
for Dune. Yeah, so they were on a roll back then, right? And at least one of the designers, once we had played a long game went a lot back and forth on Cosmic Encounter, and I just tweeted about it. I took a picture, tweeted about it, and said like, no boring moment in this game. And then one of the designers replied and said, we may as well make an alien race that exudes boredom, right? And I was like, that's all I remember of it. But I was just so smitten that the original designers had taken note that people still play their game, right? Anyway, I'm getting totally off track here, but like I think that the asymmetry in this game is intriguing from a complexity level, and it's making me want to, like, I have no idea how this works as a 2-player game, right? No clue.
Right? Yeah, that would be weird.
But I have the box right behind me with the British Way, and I could try it out at any point, I guess, because these things, I guess, especially the 2-player game, you can probably solo it pretty well. Like this game is also pretty well, like this game is not hard to solo, right? There's no hand management whatsoever, right? So
I heard the British Way. Oh, sorry, I heard the British Way doesn't even come with bots or anything, because you're just expected to two-hand it,
right?
Solo.
Right. Yeah, I might try that and report back.
Yeah, that's actually with my attempt to play coin by myself, it was actually easier just to quadruple hand it than to try to follow the flow charts, which were just crazy.
It looks so wild. I'm just like, what is this even? Yeah, so I've tried soloing things with bots in Root, and I'm like, no, I'll just play a video game, right? I'm just like, the bots, like, I wish I wanted to do it for Oath, and then I had the chance to play Oath with 2 friends, and I know that the 3-player version of Oath isn't like the optimal count, but it was still a million times better than the Prince or whatever the hell it's called, right? I've heard good things about the PAX bot, right? Like you've mentioned that the PAX solo,
oh, yeah,
right?
It's Dead simple, flip a
Well, it's
card, and
also that same person. I'm blanking on the name right now, but it's the
Ricky
same.
Royal.
What's his name? Ricky Royal.
Ricky Royal.
Yeah, same person who designed the solo version of John Company, which I have played and thought was amazing. Right.
Yeah,
So
he's got some great thoughts. He also, by the way, he designed a game called Renegade that's like a shortened version of Mage Knight, which is great. It's fantastic.
ooh, okay. I should check that out because the bots are brilliant. Like I didn't think that I was going to enjoy it, but I was sick around Christmas and I was in basically quarantining in a room, not because of COVID. I had stupid hand, foot, mouth disease, which my kids just had again. Super fun. And was sitting in the room and being like, what am I going to do? And then I soloed it on Tabletop Simulator. And it was fantastic. I had a great time. It was really, really fun. I'd also watched the entire series of like, I think 5 or 6 videos. I think it was 5 because it was the 5 rounds where Ricky Royal had soloed the base version with the bot. And I was like, okay, I think I know how to do this now. And it was super smooth. Anyway, John Company is brilliant. This is not the John Company show.
On the topic of asymmetrical, I'm just sitting on my shelf behind me. Someday it's going to have to like get it loaded up in TTS is Crescent Moon, because it really apparently you cannot play that at a reduced. There's like a 4-player count versus 5-player, but the game apparently kind of falls apart at 4 players. It really needs the full 5. But another really beautiful, really asymmetric game.
That's the Osprey Games published. Yeah, I've seen it, but I've never played it. Cool. Well, thanks. Well, okay, so it's 2:00. That only took 5 hours. I'll see if I like paste these 2 video. I'm gonna have to export them and put them into Premiere if I want to make this into a single video. But I'll see. Maybe I'll just make it 2 parts. Who cares? It's fine. I can just cut them both off at a part and just make 2 videos out of it. It'll be okay. Cool. Well, thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks for playing. That was fun.
Thanks for the teach, Andy.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, thanks for teaching.
It's
Yes, thank you for the.
I enjoy. I didn't have to do a dry run of it because I had my 2 other regular friends who I did the teach for, and as I said earlier, it went super smooth. So I was like, okay, I got this. It's fine. Because the thing is, once I get to that point, I try to remember what it was like when I first looked at the screen. Because I remember like 2 weeks ago being like, okay, I'm going to teach myself this now, and I looked at the screen of the game in the quick start scenario with the rules, and I was like, oh boy. And then I was like, I started looking to see if I could find a good explainer video, and there weren't actually any like really good explainer videos. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to go through this. And then I was like, oh, the rules are way shorter than most games from GMT that I've ever seen. And then I realized, oh, this is like 95% the same as Cuba Libre. Right. And then it became easier. But yeah, so I will archive these and put them up, and I hope everyone enjoys them, and we will be back with more Teach and Plays.